Okay, let me get all settled in here. Hey, real quickly, I do want to say that a couple weeks ago, Jay and I, we were doing a trip down in Florida where the hurricanes hit, and we were visiting some vineyard churches that had gotten very much affected. And one of the first things that we heard when we stepped off the plane was how amazing Convoy was. So Convoy had immediately hooked up with them. They were partnering with them to open up a big, huge feeding center in some of these buildings that we're doing. And we got a chance to tour around. So just so you know, that money actually does go towards things. And we got a chance to meet people that were coming in that had lost pretty much everything. I'm amazed that this stuff is still not on the news, but had lost everything. They're coming through and just grabbing what they needed for the day or two. So I cannot say to you enough what an amazing organization that is. So please be prayerful in that as we lead up to that offering. Okay, so we are continuing on. We have one more week after this week. We have one more week. We've had like a really beautiful stretch in being able to talk about something that feels so simple. It's talking about joy. We're talking about like how we've been created to be, that there's this kind of center part of who we are that was crafted and created for joy. And we've been asking ourselves the question, or at least attempting to ask the question, how can I cultivate more of that? Like at the core of my being, how can I cultivate more of this appreciation for joy in my life? We've been hitting it in a couple different kind of ways, like how does the Lord feel about you? How do you feel about your life? And then today we are taking it in a different direction. We're going to be looking at how joy, it should be infiltrating all the different relationships around you, because we've been made to be relational human beings. I know that when joy enters into families, we have more relationally kind of connected and healthy environments, don't we? Think about your own family. When we have joy entering into your work environment, you actually wake up and you go, yes, I want to be able to go. Like it's a more relationally healthy and connected place to be able to be. And when joy infiltrates churches, right? Like when it infiltrates churches, it makes it so different to be able to go. It makes it more relationally connected. And so this is such a crucial kind of piece to the way that relationships work, but oftentimes we don't consider that. And so I'm going to ask you for the next 20-some minutes, whatever, that we're just going to consider how important this is. But the thing is that we can think about this in like a really idealistic way, right? We can think about it in terms of, I don't know, just kind of like in this protected kind of bubble of an environment. We can think joy is great, and joy, we can make relationships full of joy. But yet, if you have been really wrestling through this, like this concept, if you've been really wrestling through, like, but how really do I experience joy in the midst of my life that doesn't feel very joyful? Well, then when I start to talk about relationships, then there should be a resistance as we've very much tried to figure this out. Like, how do I do this with relationships that might be not so amazing, right? Like, that might not be so easy to love, because we all have relationships around us that maybe are a little bit more tricky. They're a little bit more tricky, and maybe we've lost hope, and we've lost even a desire to be able to think, like, how can joy infiltrate that relationship? I know that for my own life, I scanned through even my last week and all the different meetings that I have, and yeah, I mean, there were some that were really great. And I'm like, yes, I can do my little joy dump, or this little exercises that we've been asking you to be able to do, where we just delight in another human being and we pour out and we saturate that person with delight. There's some that are very easy to do that, right? I mean, like I was driving in the car this week and I was taking a friend of my daughter's home. My daughter wasn't in the car, so it was just me and this little girl, this sweet girl, and she was so adorable. And she's having a rough time in her life, and had a sweet moment where we're just talking about what she wants to do in her classes that she's taking in high school. And before you know it, I felt like the Lord was like, delight, like dump it in her, like pour it in her. And I'm like, okay, I'm like responding to it. I'm like, yes, that's what we've been learning. I want to keep growing in this, So I'm like, hey, just so you know, this is what I observe about you, and this is what I see, and this is how I think that this could work. And her little cheeks get so red. Like she starts to get really flustered. Her little cheeks get red. She's like looking down. She starts smiling. Like it's the sweetest little thing in the world. And then I drop her off. I'm like, bye, and I drop her off. Her mom texts me 15 minutes later, and she's like, what happened in the car? And I'm like, am I in trouble? No, I hope I'm not in trouble. She's like, no, she said you're her best friend now. And I'm like, okay. So there's relationships that are super easy, right? And then there's the relationships where you're like, oh. Like I had a meeting this last week, and I'm like, you are very, very hard to delight in. Like there was just a way that this person was showing up in the meeting, and I'm like, dude, you are very hard right now for me. Like this is reality, right? Right? Like this is reality. And that's the thing, is that I think that God's perfectly fine with us wrestling through this and presenting before him, like, listen, good thought, God. I love that you made this kind of part of our spiritual kind of journey, but this is really hard to do sometimes. You see, we're made to be relational human beings, but yet, yes, we have to acknowledge that this takes a little bit of work, a lot of intentionality, and we have to keep kind of re-upping, like time and time again. Now, some of the things that we are talking about over these last few weeks have been literally the way that our mind is wired. Like, we're not talking about just stuff that we're reading in the scriptures, but we have this beautiful knowledge of the way that our minds and our bodies work. So when we look at the neurological way that we actually see our bodies, like right now, the things that we're learning from like neuroscientists, we have circuits in our brains. Now, those of you that have been around the last few weeks, you know what I'm talking about. There's circuits in our brains that should be firing when we start to invest in joy. When we start to invest in looking at our relationships and dumping this joy and delight in these other human beings. Now, part of our resources that we're offering you, there is a book called The Joy Switch that talks about and this is very simple. This is something that parents, you can bring home to your kids, 4 different ways that we can tell that relational circuit or switch is turned on, okay? So we're using the very fun acrostic, cake. Okay, it should be very easy to remember, but cake. So in this book, the author describes 4 different ways, starting with C as in curiosity. So when our relational switches are doing great, we're curious about other human beings. We're looking at them going, who are you and what are you about? And I want to know more, right? And then the second kind of part to that, when we can tell that our relational switches are on, are A, appreciation. So we not only are just curious about the person in front of us, whether it be a friend, a spouse, a coworker, but then we're also looking at them going, the things that I'm finding out about you, they're really interesting, and I appreciate that, and I want to say that I'm grateful for that, and thank you. We appreciate them in a very, very genuine way. The author goes on to describe that we also demonstrate, when that relational circuit is firing, that we also demonstrate kindness. That we look at the person in front of us as we are curious and we're appreciating them, and we're just kind, that our demeanor and our tone, that our heart and our minds, they're just kind. They're kind and open and loving towards that person. And then this author ends by saying the last little portion of this would be eye contact, that we are fully invested in the person in front of us. That there is not distraction, or at least if there is distraction, that we've put it aside, that we have enough strength of heart to put that aside, that the phone goes aside, that the to-dos go aside, that we can look at the person and we can go, yes, I'm curious, I appreciate, I'm kind, and I'm paying complete attention to you. Now, that's when the relationship kind of circuit is on. It's on, it's firing. But again, we are real human beings, and that little relationship circuit, if you're like me, can just flip off at the drop of a hat. I mean, some days I wake up, or some days you might even wake up and you're just feeling like, yeah, I'm on edge today, right? Or I'm a little extra tired. Or maybe there's somebody that gave you a bad look in the car on the way to work or on the way to church or whatever, dropping your kids off at school. And all of a sudden you're like, I actually don't feel like that circuit is working right now. I mean, like, right? Don't we all have those moments like that? Where we're like that is not working. Like for me, like when I talk about even tiredness, like it's probably around like 9 o'clock at night, my relationship circuit just starts to go. Like it just, like there's something about it that I'm like, ooh, it's going. I gotta get out of here. Like last night, literally my husband looked at me and he's like, what's going on? He keeps asking me all these like random questions. He's like, are you doing okay? Are you doing okay? And I'm like getting more and more frustrated as I'm like, I'm fine, you know. All of a sudden I'm like looking at the watch and I'm like, my relationship circuit is like going. I told him, I'm entering enemy territory right now. And he's like, I know, I can tell the relationship, because he knew both of us are preaching different places. He's like, so we're using this type of language. He's like, I know, the relationship circuit is like just about off right now. I'm like, I know. So I'm like, I just need to sit in silence right now. I know you're not the enemy, because basically when we consider what that's called, when we flip to the other side, Dr. Jim Wilder, where we're getting a lot of the content actually from this, for this whole series, he calls it enemy mode. He calls it enemy mode. He is a neuroscientist. He's a believer. He loves Jesus. And he says, listen, there is something that we enter into when that thing is not working. We enter into enemy mode where we look at that person in front of us and we're like, you're not on my team. You're not on my team. I don't like you. There's something about you that's like really, really, really irritating. You know, like there's something about you that I'm not liking right now, or that I don't see how this kind of works like right now with my life. Now, people that are married, like we know that we might have to fight this like many times a week, right? It's weird to be married to somebody and like literally be sleeping in the same bed with them, like inches apart, knowing that somehow you flipped into enemy mode, like before you go to bed, right? Or maybe it's even a relationship that you have with your kid where, I've got teenagers, and where you're going, we've gone into enemy mode and then good connection like 15 times in one day. Like we're just like flipping back and forth because we either aren't realizing like exactly what's happening, or we don't feel like we have maybe ultimate kind of control in that. Like we're kind of like, I don't know, like the wind is blowing and all of a sudden we're like, hey, like we're just kind of responding. Parents, come on, do you understand what I'm talking about? Like you're just kind of responding to like whatever's like coming at you, right? Or maybe it's a roommate situation where you show up to class and you're going, how's my teacher behaving right now? And you're wanting to just respond based on that way that the other person shows up. Well, I just want to say real quickly that as we investigate this real quick, when our hearts start to shift and change and we go into enemy mode, well, I want to say to you really clearly that there are ways for you to be able to recognize that about yourself. We are not at the mercy of other people determining how we show up in this world and how loving and kind that we are to other people. That thought is no small thought. We are not at other people's mercy. We live lives where God has given us complete control over our lives. He's given us control. He's given us the ability to be able to gather ourselves together. Now, some of the ways that we can determine that we have entered into enemy mode, let's go ahead and look at them real quick. Have you ever had this thought? Like, I just want to make sure, or make this problem or this person or this feeling just go away. Like maybe I'm talking to my avoiders in the crowd, because I resonate with that one. Like, just make it go away. I don't want to listen to what others feel or say. My mind is locked onto something upsetting, right? Like, these are the people that literally, you're kind of like obsessing about something, or like you just can't stop thinking about something, and you want no input whatsoever. Like, the third one, even though I usually like this person right now, I don't want to be connected to them. Like, that would be like, I've run out of margin. That would be last night for me. Like, I like you and I love you, but like I right now have nothing to give to you right now. I just want to get away or fight or freeze. I more aggressively interrogate, judge, or fix up. So listen, we all have different ways of like why we enter into enemy mode, and we have different ways of the way that gets expressed. But could I just spend the last few minutes of our time together and just say, there is a way to get out of this? There is a way. And I would hope that even right now that you are thinking about maybe a relationship in your life. Like, I want to go just like super simple. Like, maybe there's a relationship in your life where you can hold it before God this morning and just say, something's gotten kind of strange here. The way that I'm perceiving, the way that I'm seeing this person. And I would hope that God would speak to you about this, because we see in the scriptures that there is hope for this. And that this is something that isn't just something that we struggle with nowadays, but this is something that has been old as time. The way that people actually interact in relationships. In Ephesians 4, Paul is speaking about relationships. Paul is constantly interacting with people as they treat each other like different ways. And this is what he says in Ephesians 4. He said, "You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness." You see, Paul gives us another way to look at this. This isn't just a neuroscience thing that we're talking about. Paul is actually using very spiritual language, saying what is happening in your mind. You have control. God has given you the authority. This is what we're doing in this spiritual life, where he's saying this old way of being, this way that doesn't serve us, we have the choice to be able to step into something new. We have the choice. It's like literally like putting on new skin. It's entering into a different way of life. So let's talk about 3 very practical ways. And we're going to start off real quickly by looking at a psalmist. It's Psalm 73. And this is a psalmist that is finding himself in enemy mode. He is in fight or flight. And this is what he says. He says, "Surely God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. But for me, my feet had almost slipped. I had nearly lost my foothold. For I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. They have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They're free from common human burdens. They're not plagued by human ills. Surely in vain I've kept my heart pure, and I've washed my hands in innocence. All day long I've been afflicted." This guy is a wreck. I mean, the world is against him. He is against the world, right? He's filled with envy, and he's angry, and he doesn't understand why he's been following Jesus, and things aren't working. He is an absolute mess. And what he chooses to do, that we see in a few kind of verses later, is that he chooses to create soul space. He chooses to create soul space, because he recognizes that when all this stuff is coming at you and all the emotion that relationships can kind of stir inside of you, you can't deal with that in the chaos of life. You can't deal with that. You can't give it adequate time and attention. You just can't. And so basically we see, like, in just a few verses later, he says, "When I tried to understand all this, it troubled me deeply until I entered the sanctuary of God." Until I entered the sanctuary of God. You see, what he was recognizing there is that there has to be a carving away of space, because this is complex stuff that we're doing. And so when we enter into the sanctuary of God, when we have these beautiful little soul spaces, well, it's space for God to be able to speak to us, for him to be able to sort through all these like different emotions that are happening. We see this in one of my favorite stories in the scripture is Elijah. It's in 1 Kings 19. Elijah, prophet of God, neck deep in doing like everything that God would want him to do. He is just in it, right? And there's this really interesting story where he's just neck deep in conflict. He's in enemy mode, like so much so that he leaves this person that has been kind of threatening to even take his life, and he starts running into the desert. And he collapses with exhaustion in that soul space that we're talking about right now, and he collapses with exhaustion, and he just sleeps and sleeps and sleeps and sleeps. Because he recognizes, my body is exhausted. Remember, enemy mode does not do well when we're tired, right? I mean, like, that's one of the triggers, right? Like, and he sleeps and sleeps and sleeps, and then he kind of rouses himself, and then he eats a little bit, and then he sleeps and sleeps and sleeps. And then when he can finally get up, and he's just kind of interacting with God, the yuck comes out. And he's like, "God, but I thought, and I feel awful, and I want to kill myself, and I don't understand." And I mean, raw stuff, like raw emotional stuff, like you said, and your promises, and he was allowed to have that kind of sense of honesty and depth in his kind of dumping before the Lord. And it says at the very end of that exchange that God came to him in a whisper. It's a beautiful story. It's 1 Kings 9. It's a beautiful story that God came to men in a whisper. Those soul spaces, they empty us out. They allow us to be able to see like the core of like what's happening. We just have to actually make time for it. And then we have to sit there long enough so that God can identify like what's at the heart. And listen, like when I talk about kind of like the stuff, right? Like the stuff that starts to come up, the stuff that if we really trusted God, that we would give him all of it. Well, we have to admit that there's some things that start to happen when we are in enemy mode with people, and when we start to look at people and there's judgments that are made. And so it's not only just making soul space, but it's within that soul space that we have to repent of the judgments that we make around people. Because we know that when we are locked into conflict with people, that it is the human urge. It's the human urge to be able to look at that person and to dehumanize them. To be able to look at them and just say, but you aren't, or you're stupid. You're not educated enough. You're not social enough. You are meant to hurt me. And you see these judgments that, I guess, I don't know, I think about my own life and I'm like, I don't know if I'd ever admit to anybody the judgments that I have about people. But God knows. God knows. And they're unacceptable, because what happens is that we start to form a way of seeing that person to where we start to build a story about them, and then there's honestly no way for them to be able to interact with that because the story is so cemented. And what we're called to do as believers in Christ is being able to submit those judgments and to get on our knees and say, that is not okay. I'm not supposed to do that. I actually have to keep myself soft before you. I had this, with my challenging kind of conversation today or this week. I walked away and I'm like, oh God, I started to do that. Well, they're, like I started to do all the judgments, like they're trying to hurt me, and they're, like started to do that. And I felt like the Lord, actually, I created like a little space to walk later on in the day. And I felt like the Lord, instead of even interacting with me about that person, he just said, be prayerful. Be prayerful, guard your heart, be prayerful. And I'm like, okay. It's in that moment that I realized I started to kind of go down a little route that was not helpful. And the last thing that I want to say with this would be, it's not only the soul spaces or the repenting of the judgments that we're making, but it's also when we can find ourselves kind of wanting to flip that relational kind of circuit back on, appreciation is key. Appreciation is key, that we start to kind of move that kind of lever within ourselves where we start to look at that person and go, but why are you on this earth? Like, why does God love you? Like, is there something about you that I can call out, that I can appreciate you? And I'll tell you what, like that's hard to do, especially for people that hurt us and for people that don't have our best interests in mind, right? So I don't even want to act like this is like something like easy to be able to do. It's really hard. And we might have to start kind of small, right? Like I had a situation with my daughter where, we were locked into, many years ago, like we were just locked into like just critique, and I just felt like I was like criticizing her a little bit more than I wanted to do. Our room was always a mess, and like things were just not working. We weren't connecting very well. And again, I felt like the Lord was like, stop. Like you're talking to her like you're her equal. Like stop. Like she's little. Like she doesn't understand. Like turn on this appreciation. Stop making judgments. Like turn on this appreciation switch. She will respond differently. And honestly, even if she didn't respond differently, you'll be different. You'll be different. So the soul spaces and the judgment and the, repenting of judgment and the appreciation, hear me clearly, you guys. This may do nothing to turn this relationship around. Now, do we hope? Yes. Do we pray? Yes. This is for you. This is for you. This is for you to become a different type of person. This is for you. Like when Paul talks about putting on the new self, this is for you. And what I've seen about life, what I've seen about our spiritual journeys is that God really is gracious. He really is gracious. And he takes that thing that we're trying, like literally just for us, and there is influence. There is change in the relationships around us. It might take a little bit of time, but it really does happen. This is why it says very clearly in the scriptures, love your enemies. Love your enemies. It says over and over and over again, like, do the hard work. Get yourself out of enemy mode. Do this work. If anything, just for you. But we would hope, obviously, that it would extend much further, right? Okay.